And now, welcome to The Science of Hope, an introduction for victim service providers. The Center for Victim Research is delighted to have the opportunity to share this information with you because fostering hope is so central to our success in working with survivors and in supporting our staff. So I want to acknowledge that this session and everything that is done by the Center for Victim Research is supported with funding from the Office for Victims of Crime at the U.S. Department of Justice. But nothing that is said here today during today's presentation should be attributed to the Department of Justice. Our presenter today is Dr. Chan Hellman. Chan has been leading research efforts in this area for many years. He is a professor at the University of Oklahoma and is the director of the Hope Research Center. Sorry about that. And he's published over 80 articles. Among his many professional recognitions, Chan and the Hope Research Center received the 2024 Building Knowledge Through Research Award from the Office for Victims of Crime at the U.S. Department of Justice. During our time today, Chan will provide an introduction to the science of hope. After that, he'll be joined by our discussant, Kimberly Walsh. Many of you are familiar with Kimberly through her training and technical assistance work with victim service providers at JBS International. Following their discussion, we'll open the session up for your questions. So now let me step back and turn the session over to Chan Hellman. Chan?
Thank you very much, Susan. It's very much an honor to be here. I'm excited to get to present a brief introduction to the science of hope with a little bit of a focus on some of the research we've conducted in terms of outcomes associated with nurturing hope in victim services. A little bit more about me. I've been with the University of Oklahoma for over 20 years. And it was within this work at the Hope Research Center that we began working with organizations, with victim service organizations in domestic violence, child maltreatment, homelessness, and other forms of adversity. And so much of the discussion today will really cover those 20 years of experience. And so at the Hope Research Center, we're focused on three basic questions. What is hope and why does it matter? More importantly, I'm interested in understanding how trauma and adversity rob us of hope. And then ultimately, the final research question we focus on is how do your program services nurture and restore that hope? One of the things I would like to highlight before I get started with the presentation is that I believe hope offers a framework for action. That is, the science and the simplicity of hope offer a framework that we can begin to take action to nurture and restore hope and to promote well-being, both with those that are being served, as well as the staff doing this hard work day in and day out. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And so first, I want to show you a few of the spaces that we've been working in to look at how to build curriculum and programs that can nurture and restore hope. Many of you are familiar with the adverse childhood experience, so I'll use that framework as a little bit of foundation. At the national level, the average ACE score for the United States, for adults across the United States, has been reported at being just under 2. So out of those 10 adversities, of the adverse childhood experiences. On average, adults experience just under 2 of those. We've been working with departments of corrections and, in fact, just finished program services in Oklahoma, for instance, working with incarcerated women to create programs that nurture and restore hope. And what we found in this work is that incarcerated women are experiencing a significantly higher rate of adversity, of that childhood adversity, compared to the national average. Similar, we also work with juvenile affairs, juvenile rehabilitation programs, and we can see that the youth who are system involved are also experiencing significantly higher rates of adversity. And then one of the other spaces that I'll just highlight is we are working with program services that support foster youth as well as foster families. And what we find, this is actually a large sample in Oklahoma of foster youth who are between the ages of 14 and 17. So transitional age foster youth are also experiencing high rates of adversity. One of the things that I would like to highlight is that on average, foster youth in this age group between the ages of 14 and 17 also experience on average 22 different placements as foster youth. So not only are they experiencing the adversity associated with the adverse childhood experiences, they're also seeing great inconsistency or instability with regards to housing. Now, I'm not overly interested in the adverse childhood experience. What I'm much more interested in is how do these adversities, how do these trauma responses really reduce the capacity for engagement into your programs? One of the things that we know is that if the children, adults, and families will engage in your program services, outcomes will be better. So what I focused my research on is how does trauma and adversity rob us of hope? And so, for instance, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, one of the publications that we have demonstrates that children and adults with an ACE score of 1 or higher report significantly lower trust in professionals. And I can be more blunt about that. They report significantly lower trust in you. And so if I don't trust you, the question becomes, how do I engage in your program services? So these are the things that we're studying, is how trauma and adversity lead towards shame. How does trauma and adversity lead towards rumination, etc.? What I want to also highlight, as I'm going to start transitioning towards a focus on hope, is I want us to understand that well-being is more than the reduction of what is wrong. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, hope is a framework for action. So hope for us is not the outcome, it's the process. And well-being is always the outcome we focus on. The difficulty is that program services experience tremendous pressure from the system to focus on the reduction of what is wrong, identifying the adversity and focusing on that as the outcome. And while that is clearly important, what I want to make sure we understand is that, for instance, the reduction of depression is critical in our communities. But the reduction of depression is not happiness. So this framework takes a more holistic perspective. It does not ignore the adversity, but it also provides a framework of how to move forward. So as I begin to talk about the concept of hope, what I'd like to do is ask you to just reflect for a few moments and think, and perhaps you could use the chat function if you want. But when you think about the word hope, what comes to mind? What do you associate with this word hope? And fairly often when I ask that question, I'll hear things like positivity, the future will be better. There's this idea that I can overcome or endure. But I'd also like for you to reflect, is hope a feeling or an emotion that you feel? Do we feel hopeful? Or is hope a mindset? Is hope a cognitive process? Most often people respond that it's a little bit of both. But I will tell you that the framework of hope is a cognitive process. Hope is a mindset. And the reason this is so important is because if hope was an emotion, if it was a feeling that we had, then our programs would be able to help individuals manage those feelings. But because hope is a cognitive process, a way of thinking, we know it's something that can be taught. And in our work, we're working with children as young as 3 and 4, all the way across the lifespan. And what we can see is that hope can be nurtured and taught across the lifespan. So here's our simple definition. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that we have the power to make it so. Now, if I look at the first part of this definition, hope is the belief the future will be better than today. If I stop there, that's really optimism or an optimistic expectation. Hope goes beyond optimism by the latter part of the definition, that we have the power to make it so. So in this way, hope is about taking action.
Chan, before you go on, we got a couple of responses from the audience when you had asked them to name hope.
Okay.
So Marcella named it as future thinking, religion, outlook, growth mindset.
Great.
Tammy, hope is actively seeking the good. Bobby said hope is a belief in the future. For someone who's experienced trauma, it's dangerous when it's framed as positive. And Shannon says it's an expectation. And those are the comments that have come in.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I actually, Bobby, hope to kind of further address some of that because most of the work that I've been focused on is hope in the context of trauma. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this definition aspect. And in particular, what we know is that hope is actually a very simplistic idea. It's a very simple concept, and it's made up of these 3 basic components: goals, pathways, and willpower. Now, goals are the cornerstone of everything that we do with hope. From the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed, we are pursuing goals in our lives. The question with hope is whether or not we have the capacity or the ability or the access to the pathways of how we're going to pursue those goals. Pathways thinking is finding the roadmaps or the strategies by which to pursue goals. Pathways thinking is the strategy portion of hope. The third and final component is willpower. Now, for me, the way that we study willpower, it's not something you either have or don't have. I'll talk more about this shortly. But willpower is the mental energy that I have to dedicate to those pathway pursuits. What's really important to understand about hope is that both pathways and willpower are both required. We have to have both components in order to be hopeful. Now, when I first started to explore this concept of hope in the context of working with community-based programs for the last 20 years, one of the first things that occurred to me when I began to think about hope in this way is this first kind of idea. And I really am going to invite you to engage in this part of the conversation. And I'd really like to challenge you to consider this, because when I look at this model of hope, one of the first things that occur to me is that I think the language of hope is one of the single best descriptors of the work that each of you do. I believe that your program services are the pathways to goal attainment for the clients that you work with. Your program services are the pathways of hope. Each and every one of you in the work that you do are pathways of hope. So the first thing that I want to challenge you to consider is that the language of hope is one of the best descriptors of the work you already do. The difficult piece around hope is always the willpower. How do we get people to engage in your program services? So my first real challenge is to make sure you understand that through this science of hope, we're not necessarily asking you to do one more thing. We're asking you to consider this is what you already do. The second thing that I realized around this concept of hope is that this way of thinking about hope is a new way of thinking about it that I'm used to. Now, I'm from Oklahoma, and it's pretty common for us here in Oklahoma, especially as we're emerging into the spring season, where tornadoes are the much more likely to occur. It's pretty common for us to say things like, I hope there are no tornadoes today. And when the storms emerge, my willpower, my attention towards those storms greatly increases. But I have to recognize that I have no control over the weather. And what we need to understand is the distinction between hoping and wishing. Wishing is when we have the desire or the energy for a particular outcome, but no pathways. Wishing is passive towards the future. Hope is about taking action to pursue the future. And this is the difference. This is a very critical difference. Now, one of the things that I like people to consider is, what is the opposite of hope? So now that we know the definition, hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that we have the power to make it so. It's made up of goals, pathways, and willpower. So as we think about what is the opposite of hope, oftentimes, just like Marcella, say that the opposite of hope is despair. Now, I've done this training all across the United States. I've done this training in Europe, in the UK, in the Middle East, and it's very consistent that we tend to think about despair as the opposite of hope. But the loss of hope is actually a process. When you and I begin to experience barriers to our pathways, we experience anger, frustration, and anxiety. As we're still experiencing those frustrations and anger and wrestling with those barriers, we can transition to a sense of urgency. The problem with urgency is we can begin to start making rash decisions. And then ultimately, despair is not the opposite of hope, because with despair, I still have that mental energy or that willpower towards that thing I cannot have. The problem with despair is that it oftentimes can lead towards desperation. And then ultimately, apathy is the opposite of hope. So just a couple of quick studies, and I won't get too statistical in nature unless somebody asks a question later on, which I'm happy to get into the details of these studies. But what we've been looking at is how does trauma and adversity rob us of hope? And so one of our studies demonstrated that the adverse childhood experience leads to a higher rate of ruminating on the past, which tends to lower hope. Another one of our publications shows that the adverse childhood experience leads to a higher rate of post-traumatic stress, which leads to a higher rate of anxiety, which again leads to lower levels of hope. Again, the focus is on how does trauma and adversity rob us of hope. And then this is a study that we published a couple of years ago or finished a couple of years ago. And what we found is that adverse childhood experience leads to a higher rate of insecure adult attachment, which leads to lower levels of hope. So I want to talk about this just a little bit deeper. How does trauma and adversity influence goals, pathways, and willpower? Now, this first set of bullets is one of the probably most important findings that we've discovered. And what we've learned is that when you and I are experiencing tremendous adversity, we are much more likely to set goals that are avoidant in nature. But as program services tend to have positive impacts, what we see is a transition from an avoidant mindset towards an achievement mindset. And the reason that this is so important is, let me give you a quick example. Imagine a basketball player whose mindset is, I want to get the ball and shoot the winning shot for the team. That's an achievement mindset. But if you think about the basketball player whose mindset is, I hope they don't throw me the ball because I'm probably going to lose it and really disappoint my team. That's an avoidant mindset. The reason this is so important is I want you to understand how those two players behave on the court. The nature of our goals drives our pathways thinking. The other thing that we found is that when clients are in tremendous distress, when they're in a survival framework, it is so much better to set short-term specific goals than long-term broad-based goals. We've also found that during adversity, pathways thinking become quite difficult. Remember I said during a sense of urgency, we can begin to get into these rash decisions. What our research also shows is that children really struggle with how do we get there from here. More importantly, they struggle with, once they experience a barrier, how do they overcome it? And then finally, I want to focus for a moment on willpower. And this idea is that first and foremost, the research, the over 600 published studies on this concept of willpower show us that willpower is a limited resource. So I want you to think about when you go home at the end of the day and you're mentally exhausted or emotionally exhausted, that's what I'm referring to, that willpower has been drained. Now, here's the problem. Willpower is strongly associated with self-regulation, the ability to regulate our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And then finally, there's a body of research that shows that our willpower is associated with the glucose in our systems. And so, as you know, glucose for us is our source of energy. And when that glucose depletes, so too does that willpower. The big takeaway for me, especially in victim services, is that nutrition matters. Access to nutrition becomes an important part of strategies to nurture hope. The good news is we know how to teach hope. We've actually conducted studies showing that we can see significant increases in hope in about 1 hour. The question becomes, how do we sustain that? So the strategies for this, I've just left this slide up so you can see that we really break down hope. What is hope? How is it different from wishing? Then it's goals, pathways, and willpower. I see a couple of statements asking if the presentation will be available. I'm certainly happy for that to be accessible. And we can talk about that, Susan, afterwards. There's a couple of studies where we've begun to look at hope and well-being. And one of the things that we've looked at is hope relative to resilience. And what we find is that both hope and resilience have strong positive associations with well-being. But when we build the predictive models, what we find is that hope becomes the stronger predictor of well-being. And you'll notice in this slide that for us, when we study well-being, we study the concept of flourishing as the outcome, not happiness, but flourishing. Now, this is a study that, again, I want to challenge you to really think about this, because I think this actually applies very directly to the program services that each of you work in. So in Oklahoma, we've trained all of our child welfare workers at the state agency. And one of the questions that we had is caseworkers who are working with foster youth. One of the questions becomes, given my caseload, I get 1 hour a month with a foster youth. So what good can 1 hour a month be? So we asked foster youth, do you see your caseworker as somebody who helps you set goals? Is your caseworker somebody who helps you find pathways to your goals? Does your caseworker help you overcome barriers or find solutions? And what we found is that when youth see their caseworker as a source of hope, their own hope scores increase. But remember, hope is not the outcome. And we actually tracked that towards looking at improvements in grades, attendance, reduction in behavioral issues, and an increase in the motivation towards academics. So we know that 1 hour a month can have tremendous positive outcomes. And so this leads me to start wondering, what would 12 hours look like? What if we began to think about a hope-centered organization or a hope-centered system where everybody who's working with the youth and families are engaging in the science of hope? I'm going to be wrapping up pretty quickly. One of the things that we've looked at, this was a community-wide assessment where we're looking at, it's called the Cantrell Ladder of Wellbeing, and it essentially asks you to consider your life as the rungs on a ladder. And if we ask you, where do you see your life, with rung number 1 as the worst possible conditions and rung number 10 as the best possible conditions. And so you can see the first 4 rungs: suffering, then struggling, then thriving. So what we look at is, how is hope associated with well-being? And what we can see is that when we give the hope assessment for those children and adults who score lower in hope, you can see that they see their lives on rung number 2. So what I want you to pay attention to are the significant increases in well-being at each level of hope. And for victim services, what this helps us understand is that you don't have to focus on solving the problem. You just focus on moving the needle, and good outcomes start to occur. So that was why I wanted to share with you that particular slide. So just using the Q&A function, just have a quick question for you. This was a very brief introduction to hope, and Kim Walsh and I are going to engage in a little bit deeper reflection on this, but based on what you've heard, a question that I have is, where have you seen hope in your organization? Where have you seen hope in your work? And ask you to please use the Q&A function to respond to that. And so I think I'll transition as you're thinking about that and hopefully putting in some comments in the Q&A. I think we'll transition to a brief conversation between Kim and I, and then ultimately leave a little bit of time to respond to the Q&A. So Kim, I think we've got about maybe about 10 minutes-ish for conversation.
Sure. Yeah, so, one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking, and just for the audience, I'd like to say a couple things. One, I've gone through several of the trainings with Chan and his colleagues, and the first time I went through the Navigator training, I felt like I needed to do it like 5 more times in order to really kind of get it. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't had the opportunity to do the full Navigator training and you do have that opportunity, I would definitely encourage people to consider that and reach out to Chan and talk with him about that. I've now done it a few times and feel that I'm beginning to understand and have a better sense of space and time with the work. And one of the things that really is powerful for me is, first of all, learning my own hope score and just understanding where I was and beginning to understand how that manifested in my life and my work. I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence, and I lived through significant adversity as a young person. And I was always somebody who could find a way to move forward. And, I started to be able to put words to what my experience was, but also understand the experiences of others and what their experiences weren't, and that they weren't exactly like mine. And I think one of the comments earlier was along that line of, I feel like someone said, I feel that my trauma has fueled me and provided me space and time to, advance hope, and that it's empowered my hopefulness. And I think that's incredible. And I know that Chan will have something to add to what I'm saying, but one of the critical pieces is, I think, the self-care that has to occur when you are the person that is sort of the caseworker, if you will, in the recent example that Chan just covered. If you're the person that is supposed to be instilling hope and advancing and leading that and encouraging that, you have to find that for yourself first. And so that self-care, and as social workers, and I don't know if everyone on the call is a social worker or you come from different disciplines, but that is such an important part of the work, and having the fuel and the energy to then advance that in others. And so I just wanted to sort of say that, and I don't want to monopolize this 10 minutes, but Chan, you probably have something that you want to say, to what I've just talked about. But and if there's other questions that people have, I'd love for you to put them in the chat.
Sure. Well, thank you, Kim, first of all, for being part of this, and for opening up a little bit about your own personal experience and Hope's relation to that. One of the things that we started to focus on 4 or 5 years ago is to begin to look at really hope in the context of the workforce. And our training program is actually focused on, initial program is actually not so focused on how do you do this with clients, but more how do you do it with yourself. I think the best way to learn hope is to experience it. And what we began to see is that when individuals began to experience hope-centered goal setting and pathway development, we saw significant reductions in burnout, significant reductions in secondary traumatic stress. And so that led us on a journey of really kind of stealing from a hero of mine, Brene Brown. You cannot give what you do not have.
That's right.
And so our first and initial engagement in any space is to nurture your hope. And then we transition to that Hope Navigator space, which is how do we create hope-centered programs where we're doing hope with intention. And in that space, we not only see improvements in client outcomes, but as everybody in this session can tell us, is when you see hope, when you're working with a survivor or a victim and you see that important moment where hope has been activated and you see that success that's starting to happen, it's not only great and wonderful for the clients, it's good for you. It's good for you to see that your work is having that impact. And sometimes that's harder than others, but doing hope is good for clients and good for you.
I think what that reminds me of is when we did the first training, I remember writing down, Chan, hope begets hope, was something that you said not once, but a few times. And it really speaks to what you just said in your statement. And it really is an powerful component of the work, and it's something that I remember. The other thing that I pulled from was the work that you did with First Lady Stitt in Oklahoma, and one of the quotes was, "Hope is the bridge between the impossible and the possible." And I love that, because that, for me, I keep those kinds of quotes around my desk and when I'm working and in my phone and different places, because there are times in our current environment, our current experience, it's complicated, and it really doesn't matter which side of the fence you're on or what belief system you have. It's a complex environment that we're in right now. So hopefulness or being hopeful or instilling hope or advancing hope is not as simple as it may sound, and it really does take a concerted thought process and I think in investment. And I think through connectedness, there's a way to do that, because I think, managing hope alone is not always the way to go. And I know you have a lot to say about that, and maybe you're the expert, and I'll just bring it up and I'll let you talk about it. But I think it would be important for people to hear a little bit about that, the connectedness piece.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you for that. And a couple of things. Honestly, I've got like a million things I feel like I need to say. But I greatly appreciate when people, talk about how the science that we're building and the work that we're doing is helping. And I want to go back to that early slide where I asked you and engaged the audience. I had goals and then the kind of the triangle pathway. And I challenged you to consider that hope, that you are a pathway of hope for the clients that you serve. And so the first thing that I want to say is that while I appreciate the comments about the work that we're doing, I want everybody to understand is we're simply studying what you do, right? It's your work we're studying. You truly are that pathway of hope for the families and the community that you serve. Going directly to the connectedness piece, one of our guiding principles in our curriculum is that hope is a social gift. And the reason this is so important is because we know that hope happens in relationships, that it happens in connectedness. The research is very clear that one of the strongest predictors of hope is connection. So we have to create opportunities and spaces for that connection. So whether that's engaging in program services, whether that's engaging in a support network. I have to tell you, I'm becoming increasingly enamored and excited about peer programs, people with lived experiences who've been deeply trained in hope, who are walking along other side of individuals. And I just think there's something powerful about that shared experience, but the connection in and of itself is just critical.
And for a long time, years ago, I spent several years as an advocate, supporting survivors of intimate partner violence. And to speak to that, there's an instant connection that you have with someone who has that experience, and being able to so I think being able to instill hope in those moments of darkness, and even in incremental steps of, it doesn't have to be big, lofty, long-term goals, but those incremental steps that we can do in an intentional way that really paves a path forward for someone, that whatever their experience is. And, I spent years working in the substance use disorder arena as well, and leading state systems. And the same applies, it's those incremental steps and being able to instill and support that goal setting and the way power that is necessary for folks to find their way toward that goal. And sometimes, even identifying a goal can be a struggle from the get-go.
Yes.
And so being the light that sort of supports that to happen is an incredible gift that all of you that are on this webinar today bring to the work that you do. So
yeah, I love that you said that, Kim. I'm as you know this, and I'm pretty public with this, certainly in the book, but also in the work that I do with organizations. A former homeless youth, child of a survivor, all of the things associated with that, which all greatly informs sort of the research that we're doing. I tend, on a personal level, in that, but also what I know from the research, is oftentimes I'll hear people talk about hope as light at the end of the tunnel, but I like to think of hope as light in the tunnel, because in the darkness of despair and adversity, that's when I need hope. I need hope in the tunnel. And so I love, kind of how you frame that, because, as a homeless youth, I would have teachers come to me and say, hey, you need to do better on an exam if you want to go to college. And I got to tell you, when I'm in survival mode, that has no meaning to me. I am so focused on, where am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? How am I supposed to stay safe? And so we have to understand that focusing on short-term specific goals around scenarios that I have some level of control, that's where we've got to stay focused. When we get focused on the big, complex system problems and everything that's going on, it's so overwhelming. And that mountain seems so difficult. And all I've got to say is the research is very clear. You don't have to summit the mountain. You just have to make it to that first switchback.
yeah, yeah.
And we know that hope begets hope. With foster youth, when a foster youth tells us, if you could imagine, I could go up and say, hey, what are your goals? And a response might be, I don't have any goals. And that's okay. That's a great place to start. We will follow that up with, well, what are some goals kids your age, people that what are some of the goals they have? And we just start the process, and it's such a powerful predictor of those outcomes. So,
I wish we had, I'm trying to follow the Q&A too, to see all of the different comments that are being entered. And I wish we had time to really spend on like each and every one of them individually, because the comments that have been entered are so thoughtful and they're real. You know, there's such, you know, comments about what do we do when we're working with and trying to support populations that are experiencing extraordinary
Yes.
adversities and feeling attacked, or you know, and that's so complicated, and
Yeah.
and I think the alternative to not finding, you know, glimmers of goals or hopefulness and instilling some intentional strategies is that end of the spectrum, or the opposite of hope, which is apathy.
Right.
And I know that there's nobody on this call today that would want that to be anyone's reality. And so, you know, it is impossible sometimes. It feels impossible to think of something that we can hang on to, whether it's, you know, their family, the family connections, the fact that they have you in their corner. Because from my perspective, if you're interacting with someone, you're in their corner and you are part of the hope that they have for making good decisions and experiencing next steps in a way that maybe they would have not on their own been able to achieve. And so I feel really humbled by some of the comments that are in this chat and in the Q&A, because I know that the work that many of you are doing seems daunting and extraordinarily overwhelming right now. And
yeah, I think that's critical. I personally, my interest is how do we nurture and restore hope in urgency,
Right.
despair, and
Right.
apathy. I think if
Absolutely.
we're going to do hope work, that's where we've got to do it.
That's right.
And the question that I see in the Q&A from Bobby and what I would tell you is we've worked with every one of those populations. We've done hope work in those spaces. With immigrants and with, you know, just tremendous levels of hope for future, predominantly focused on their children in the presence of just tremendous adversity. So I would just invite you in those spaces to if nothing else, just Google that population and hope. We've worked with the LGBTQ plus community. And what I first would like to tell you is that there is hope there. Those communities do in fact have hope, and it can be nurtured and restored, even in the presence of completely complex adversities. But to initially go at this from the framework of these populations can't have hope, what I would tell you is just tremendously frustrating, because I can tell you in the spaces where I've done that work that is the very thing that keeps people going. And we've got to find ways to nurture it and to support.
I think that's where this webinar is fabulous, because it provides an introduction, but I think digging deeper into the training that Chan does, and you know, learning more. And one of the things that we've done at JBS and in some of our project work is some hope power hours, where we bring people together and just really advance you know, all of the different aspects of hope and how to advance hope, and really again kind of nurturing that hope begetting hope. I know Jenny Cole Mossman is on today and has hosted some of those power hours. And I don't know if Jenny, you have anything, I don't know, even if you can come off mic or whatever, if you have anything you want to add to those power hours and how those have been experienced, that might be helpful for folks. And certainly if you're interested in learning how to do that, or would like to pattern something in your own organizations, we'll share anything we have.
Yeah, there I know we're going to probably be coming on to end of time. Taylor asked a question about workplace culture and leadership buy-in, and we're in over 10 states now, and working with state agencies and nonprofit organizations and school districts and school systems. We've created a framework around hope-centered leadership. A whole model in this space of workplace culture where we begin to focus on the tremendous power of individual hope, but transitioning that to this idea of collective hope. And if individual hope is such a powerful predictor of well-being, I begin to wonder, what does collective hope look like in an organization, in a community, in a system, especially multidisciplinary team systems like child advocacy centers or family justice centers, because each of them are pathways of hope towards a common goal. And I see that Jenny is ready to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Chan and Angela did a power hour for an OJJDP project for continuums of care, kind of looking at really youth well-being. And I think one of the things we wanted to stress, because there are so many initiatives and there's so much going on and people are learning so much, and it's one of the things I so appreciate about Hope Navigation, is it's like laying on top of what you already know, fine-tuning what you already know. We had a lot of interest from our grantees, and I think it's because it really is putting a fine point on some of the things you're wanting to do, but you don't quite know how to make the needle move. So I'm looking forward to more, and I can't echo enough Kim's sentiments too. Like when I went through Hope Navigation training and it all clicked for me, I was like, well, I can use this everywhere. So I love it.
Yeah,
Jan,
thanks,
this is-
Jenny.
Thanks, Kim. I want to jump in with just a couple of questions, highlighting a few things that have come in, and one that came in earlier because it affects so many people on this call. Right now, there is so much, not only were victim service providers facing funding cuts, but now there's so much disruption and uncertainty in the processes that we were used to using, and the problem seems so big. And Chan, you talked about setting small goals to get us through and keep us on the pathway to hope. What might you suggest for how people can focus on that small, hopeful goal that maybe sets them up for bigger changes in the future?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So first and foremost, what I want to make sure we understand is that hope is about the possibility, but for me, it provides a framework for action. So I start to think about: is this a goal problem? Is this a pathways problem? Is this a willpower problem? And then begin to use that as a framework to go. What I will tell you is, setting short-term specific goals during this tremendous time of disruption is the best strategy. Now, that still feels overwhelming, so you want to lean into certainly the spaces that you have the most control over. What we do is work with start setting goals in the important domains of your life. Like, what is my goal for my family? What is my goal for my health? What is my goal for my work team? And start to think about what are your goal specific ideas in those spaces, and then begin to look at what step can I take today in this hope begets hope model. I want to remind everybody that over the last 5 years, we've been experiencing tremendous adversity. Think about the pandemic and the very significant disruption of services. And if nothing else, I want to remind you, you've done hard things before. We've all had to find those new creative ideas of how do you still serve victims in this complex pandemic that we went through or going through or whatever it is right now. So I think first of all is remember we've done hard things before, and we will get through this. For us, what we began to focus on with the organization is, and Kim brought this up, the importance of connection. So we started to build these, what we call hope huddles. That is, in staff meetings, spend 10 minutes talking about where you've seen hope. Begin to identify hope heroes. That is, find somebody in the organization who found a very creative, strategic way to still serve victims in these complex spaces. It's happening, and we just need to lean into the good stuff that's happening in the work that you're doing.
Jan, there's another question that I think we ought to get to today, which is what would you expect to see in an organization that understands the importance of hope? You've worked and trained so many organizations. So what would change about ways of communicating or workplace culture or other elements like that?
Yeah, so we've actually been studying that pretty specifically. And one of the first things that we find is that the language of hope, when everybody starts to understand what hope is, that it creates a common language across the organization. As all of us know, within our own special jobs, we have our own language. And we talk in that language, oftentimes in acronyms, as if everybody else understands that, and we don't. And so what we found is that at the very least, it provides a common language. With that, we saw significant improvements in trust, communication, and cohesion. In the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, our largest state agency, 6,000 employees, we trained all 6,000 employees. We saw a 3-year trend growth in hope scores during the pandemic. And then in 2022, the agency reported a 17% reduction in turnover. We can shift organizational cultures through this common language of hope. And remember, hope is not wishing. It's a framework for action. And that's what everybody has to lean into is what are the pathways and strategies that exist to bring people together.
All right, thank you. I see we have run out of time, although we could go on talking for another 2 hours. There's so many wonderful ideas that have been shared, wonderful reflections shared on the Q&A tab, and also some questions that we didn't get to. And then a lot of people have been asking specifically about the navigator training. So we will compile those inputs, questions, we'll get answers to them, we'll take out people's identifying information, and we'll share that with everyone who was on this webinar today. So I do want to thank Chan for sharing his research, and thank Kimberly for joining us as a discussant. We're very grateful for our ASL interpreter today, keeping up with everything. And thanks to all of you out there for everything that you are doing on a daily basis to try to keep hope in yourself, your staff, and the people that you work with. Thank you so much for your attention today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the work you're doing.